Okay, and I will do my screen share here, and then we will get started. Okay. So, welcome back. I'm broadcasting live today from here at the township, so it's a little unusual having an audience. I'm usually in by myself in my fortress of solitude up in my room. So anyway, we're going to be talking about the last part of the rise of the early Christian church. We've been talking about what's called the Patristic Era, basically about the 500 years prior to the fall of Rome. There was the apostolic, which occurred, obviously, the rise of Jesus and the apostles up to about 100 AD. And then we had what's called the Ante-Nicene age, which was that period of time prior to the Council of Nicaea, where they passed the Nicene Creed, kind of a crossroads for the early Christian church because it faced a lot of problems, a lot of persecution, could have easily gone away, but instead it actually flourished. And with the beginning of the Council of Nicaea, actually became the accepted religion within the church, within the Roman Empire, and at the same time, within another 60, 70 years, became the state religion of the Roman Empire. So it's really a miraculous turn of events there. Then we saw what was called the Nicene age, that period of time that we were just talking about, where the church, basically flourished. This is the last part. This is the period of time prior to what we traditionally call the Middle Ages. And that's where I'm going to stop, because at this point, I've kind of gone to my limit as far as ancient history, and that's where I chose to stop. I do encourage you to follow on watching Pastor Dwayne's Bible study on Wednesdays, because he is going to be talking about this same period of time, that the Middle Ages, and talking about the Reformation and Martin Luther and John Calvin. So let's get going here and see what we can see. The post-Nicene age. The post-Nicene age corresponds roughly from the 5th century through the 8th century, which encompasses the fall of the Roman Empire and Europe's descent into the Dark Ages. That's what they're called. I don't particularly care for that term. Most historians don't, but that's what it's called, the early medieval period. It also saw the Christian church, big C, Catholic, become the primary institution in the West to maintain religious, social, economic, and political unity. Because for all practical purposes, the Roman Empire ceased to exist. It continued on in the eastern part of the empire, in what's called the Byzantine Empire, up to about 1400 or so, when it was finally overtaken. And of course, the church separated during this period of time between the Big C Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church of the Eastern Roman Empire. Politically, socially, and economically, the West entered this Dark Ages. The church continued to grow, not just in size, but in power and theologically. The powerful Bishop of Rome would become known as the Pope during this period of time, with primacy over the rest of the bishops in the West. So let's see what happens next year. The church faced a lot of problems during this period of time. It had solved a lot of problems during the Nicene period, particularly that old problem of the Trinity. What is the nature of Jesus? That, as Pastor Dwayne has said so eloquently, the Greeks got involved and they parsed the words. And, for the most part, at least on the surface, this problem of the Trinity had been solved. But it didn't go away. And there continued to be heretical movements pop up in this post-Nicene era, never as big as Arianism. Remember, Arianism was this heresy which really challenged the church for quite some time. But they were still kind of a thorn in the side to the church, and they had to be dealt with. One of the biggest ones was something called Nestorianism. Nestorianism was a product of a 5th century patriarch of the Church of Constantinople, the head of the Church of Constantinople. He kind of taught that Jesus, the divine, was separate from Jesus, the human. He did not deny that Jesus was human and divine. He just said they're two different things. There's no unity there. And it got really confusing to people. And for the most part, he split much of the Christian community in the eastern part of the empire. He also began to teach that Mary gave birth only to the human Jesus, that he was not God, he was not incarnate when he was born. Kind of that old thing about adoptionism, when God basically adopted Jesus at his baptism. And his teachings really came into conflict with the Western church, particularly one of the big leaders of the church at Alexandria by the name of Cyril. And we'll talk about him here in a few minutes. And he actually issued 12 edicts of excommunication against Nestor. Remember, Nestor was a patriarch of the church. I mean, he was a big deal in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Finally, they met at one of the many ecumenical councils they held in the 5th century, and the Council of Ephesus in 431. And Nestor and most of his followers were excommunicated. It was declared heretical, and most of them moved out of the Roman Empire. And at that point, that religion still kind of continued on. You can still find elements of it today in the Assyrian church. There are still certain elements of Nestorianism within certain parts of the old breakaways from the Orthodox Church at this time. So here's kind of a chart, and you can see basically he taught a divided Christ. Human nature, divine nature, and the two shall never meet. That kind of thing. It's kind of a weird idea. Remember, these things are they seem so obvious to us today that we don't even think about this. But back in these days, this was a big deal because they were really struggling with exactly what the nature of Jesus was. There were some other heresies. I just want to mention 3 of them real rapidly. There was something called Monophysism. I don't know if I'm saying that right or not. The heresy was a reaction to Nestorianism, which arose in the 5th century. And it taught that Jesus was divine only, and that his human nature was absorbed by his divine nature. In other words, they went the opposite route. They said, well, yeah, it was unified, but once he became divine, and once he was born, his human nature was absorbed by the divine. I mean, it just makes it seemed like they were splitting hairs to me. It seemed like they were just concerned with the smallest things. This, of course, was condemned at a church council, the one at Chalcedon in 451, and its followers, much as the followers of Nestor, basically abandoned the church. And again, you can still find elements of it today, particularly in the Armenian Apostolic Church and the Ethiopian Church. Still has elements of monophysism in it. And then there was here we go, Elitism. Whew, the heresy arose in the 6th century under the leadership of a man by the name of Sergius, who was another patriarch of the Church of Constantinople. So these things didn't come about from some small thing. These were basically big divisions within the church, because the patriarch was kind of like the equivalent to the Pope in Rome, in the West. He was the patriarch of Constantinople. And he had basically hoped he was going to try to bring these monophysites back into the church. And he said, and I don't even understand this. This is just, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. Jesus had both a human and divine nature, but he had only one will. Now, maybe Pastor Dwayne will want to talk about that. I don't know. It makes no sense to me. But that's what they taught, that his nature was basically unified, but his will was separate. Pardon me, they were, they only had one divine will. There was not a human will. Again, it just seemed like they were parsing words here, kind of out in the weeds. And then there was a pretty good sized one called Pelagianism. Pelagianism really was a pretty strong heresy. And I think Pastor Dwayne's going to talk a lot about this tomorrow. Founded by a man by the name of Pelagius around the 5th century. He was an Irish monk. And he moved to Rome, began to teach a doctrine that denied original sin. And he began to say that man could avoid evil and win salvation by the power of his own free will, in a sense, almost denying grace. Not denying it, but saying that basically grace was not necessary for salvation. You could get salvation through your works. And that really went against a lot of the people. And St. Augustine, as we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, was really an opponent of Pelagianism, and he really fought strong against Pelagianism. This was one of his really important targets that he talked about during his rise to power as one of the great theologians of the post-Nicene age. And then there was a heresy that really doesn't quite come across as a heresy, because it really wasn't an offshoot of Christianity, but it was a challenge to Christianity in this era, in this post-Nicene age. It's called Manichaeism. And it was founded by a man by the name of Mani, who came out of the old Persian Empire. And he taught basically that there was a world struggle between good, spiritual, light and evil, material world of darkness. And he further taught that the teachings of Jesus, Zoroaster, which was the kind of the prophet of the old Zoroastrianism, the old Persian religion, and Buddha, he even brought in Buddha, were incomplete, and that he was anointed by God to establish the religion of light. And so he kind of broke away from all this Christian stuff himself, and he kind of is almost more akin to Muslim, the Islamic religion, in a sense, that Islam kind of believed in all the old patriarchs of the church, but Muhammad said, I have completed the church. Well, the same thing with Manichaeism. Manichaeism basically kind of said, I've completed the history of the church. Now I am the new prophet. And there was actually quite a few people that followed this. Augustine was a Manichaeist before he became a Christian. He actually was a follower of Mani before he became a Christian. It flourished primarily in Rome and Egypt, and became the main rival of Christianity to replace classical paganism for several centuries. Although it was persecuted by the Roman government and stamped out of the Western Roman Empire by the 4th century, it continued to exist as a strong religion in the East, and then challenged by Islam. Islam finally basically broke the back of Manichaeism, because they kind of taught the same thing. Muhammad was basically replacing the prophets of the Old Testament and even Jesus. If you don't know that much about Islam, Islam actually, they accept Jesus as a prophet. They accept Abraham and all the old prophets of the Old Testament, but they believed that they were not complete. It was only Muhammad that completed the scriptures. And that's the difference. So this was also a period of time where we had some of the more famous church fathers of the old Christian church. One of them was a man by the name of John of Antioch, but we all call him John Chrysostom, the golden tongue one. You know, he was a preacher, and they say that his sermons were just magnificent. In fact, there's hundreds of them have been preserved. They are still in existence today, and you can read these old sermons. I'm not going to lie, I've never read any, so I'm just relaying what I've been taught as such. But they say that his sermons were quite magnificent, and it made him one of the great preachers of the early Christian church. But unfortunately, he got a little carried away, and he started attacking the wife of the empress of what became the Byzantine Empire. And because she had some faults, and she had, as was customary probably amongst most of the rulers, that she was rather secular in her beliefs and such, and he began to really attack her. Not a smart thing to do, if you're wanting to exist here. And so ended up, he was exiled away from the old Eastern Roman Empire for quite some time. The story goes that he was finally welcomed back to the empire by her son when she passed away. And it's said that her son basically begged him for forgiveness on the part of his mother for exiling him away from the Roman Empire. Again, you get wrapped up in all this oral tradition, so you don't know how much of it is true or not. And then there was Cyril of Alexandria, one of the other early great fathers of the church. And again, we've talked a little bit about Cyril because Cyril was one of the primary opponents, was the primary opponent of Nestorianism, this thing that taught a divided Christ between a divine and a human nature. And he again was a patriarch of he was the patriarch of Alexandria, and he tackled the patriarch of Constantinople. And so we really had a big feud going on here between the Eastern and the Western churches, which kind of started a real drift away between the Orthodox and the Catholic Church at this period of time. And eventually they split totally in the about 1000, I think it's actually 1054 AD. They split in what's known as the Great Schism, the Great Split. And although they kind of consider themselves cousins, they still do not consider themselves together. There's been movements in recent years to try to bring them back together, but that's probably never going to happen for a lot of reasons, mostly politics. So this was two of the great fathers here. There was also Jerome. We mentioned Jerome kind of a little bit. Jerome is primarily responsible for translating the Bible into Latin. Up to this point, the Bible, as it had been put together, and it was kind of together by this period of time, was written in Greek because that was the language of the Western part of the empire. But as Rome grew in prominence, the leaders of the church wanted the Bible to be written in Latin because that was kind of the language of the Western part of the empire. As it turned out, Latin would soon go away, except for being an official language of the empire. And in fact, the case that was one of the problems within the church during the medieval ages was that the church was preaching and teaching in Latin, and most of the people would be sitting out there listening to the priest and like, I have no idea what the man's saying, because they didn't know Latin. They were speaking in the vernacular now, Italian and French and English. I mean, old versions of those languages. And so they had no idea what was going on. They had to rely totally upon, the fact that the priest was teaching, and they had to accept his word as what he was saying was right, because only the chosen, only the elite, only the educated could speak Latin. But this is when the Bible gets translated into Latin. It's called the Vulgate version. And there are still uses of the Vulgate Bible. It's still being used in the church. 1962, the church basically did away with I think it's called the Lateran Mass, the old Latin Mass. Although, as I've told you before, there are still communities that still do the Latin Mass. It's frowned upon by the church. In fact, I'm not sure the church even basically accepts it. But I know there are communities that still do the Latin Mass because they just don't want to go away from it. They feel like that's the tradition, and they feel like that's what ought to be done. So, and then there was finally Leo the Great. Leo the Great was actually not so much a church father as he became the man that became the first pope. Now, when I say that, I want to make sure you understand something, what I'm saying here. The term pope had been applied to all bishops for some time. Papa, pater. They were the heads of the individual churches. But as the Church of Rome grew in prominence and grew in leadership, it eventually came to the point that only the Bishop of Rome could be called the Pope. And that occurred primarily under Leo the Great. It was a gradual process. It didn't take place just like that. But it basically came to fruition under Leo the Great as being the person that we kind of point towards in history as being the man from whom the title Pope is applied to only the Bishop of Rome at this point. So that's a big deal because that is where you begin to see the leadership of the Bishop of Rome as the man that basically takes charge of the Big C Catholic Church. So there's a example of the Latin Mass. Coming from a background of fundamental Baptist religion, that is so unique to me because we have not much of an altar, you know. In fact, there's almost no altar, you know. Sometimes there's not an altar. And, you know, to see that, I mean, it's beautiful. You know, I always look at these pictures and think, you know, how majestic it looks and how great it looks. And I understand it, but it's so foreign to some of us, particularly in the Protestant realm that maybe come from churches that have a lot more of a primitive feel to them, in a sense. I've often laughed at my nephew, who is a fundamental Baptist preacher, and he calls himself a walnut Baptist, hard-shelled, you know, and he is definitely a hard-shelled Baptist preacher, that's for sure. Okay, and then there's this man, Augustine. Augustine was the giant of the church fathers. He was one of the last of the church fathers, but he is often looked upon as being the greatest of these church fathers. With the end of the Patristic Era, the era of the church fathers ended. And at that point, the church, and again, I'm talking about Big C Catholic Church, basically says this is the end of that era where individual people received revelation to them. And at this point in time, it kind of ends here. Augustine was one of the last of these, and he was without a doubt the giant of the church fathers. Augustine was quite a character. He was born in North Africa around a little town called Hippo, 354 to 430 AD. And he's basically, as I've said, he's considered to be the greatest of the church fathers of the patristic age. He was born in what we now call Algeria. His father was a pagan, but his mother was a very sincere and devout Christian. And he apparently was just an absolutely brilliant student, particularly in the area of rhetoric, argumentation, you know, kind of like Rosie, you know. At about age 17, he began a relationship with a young woman that lasted for 15 years, up to almost his 30s, produced a son. He was a follower of Manichaeism, and he had this concubine and had a son by him, and he accepted her as his wife. He accepted his son as his son. Now, I need to stop here a little bit and talk about this. We know now today, of course, that the Big C Catholic Church forbids its priests to marry. At this point in time, I'm not for sure, but I think this point in time is where you begin to see movement with the monastic age and the monasteries, where people begin to, you know, form in the doctrine of the church that priests were better off not to marry. They became the bride of Christ, in a sense. And at this point in time, you begin to see the movement away. Up to this point in time, this probably would not have been that unusual, you know, even after Augustine became a Christian. And again, the bonds of matrimony during this period of time were pretty loosey-goosey, you know. They weren't sealed in stone, kind of like they are today, where you got big certificates and all like this. They were basically a thing of local, you know, you were married and that's it. And he probably accepted this woman as his wife and his son as his son. As he became a Christian, he realized that what he had done was in the wrong, and he chose basically to abandon her and send her on his way, although he did keep his son with him, even after he became a leader in the church. Son, unfortunately, died at a very early age. Now, when he became a good student, he basically was sent to Milan. Milan was one of the great early schools of education within the Big C Catholic Church. And so he was sent to Milan to study, and he fell under the tutorship of Ambrose. We've talked about Ambrose. Remember, he's the guy that forced the Eastern Roman Emperor to come to his hands and knees in the snow, begging forgiveness for 3 days until, Ambrose was kind of the man that set the tone for the political popes of the Middle Ages. And he came under the tutorship of Ambrose, and Ambrose converted him, made him into a Christian. He abandoned Manichaeism. He abandoned his concubine, said, I can no longer be with you, and sent her away, which, the Me Too movement would not be happy about that today. And also basically took his son in. His mother had followed him to Milan because his mother never gave up the hope that he would become a Christian. And she kind of was always there behind the scenes, manipulating Augustine, saying, you've got to get rid of this woman. You've got to be a Christian. He finally converted to Christianity. And once he did, boy, did he convert. Okay. He was a brilliant man, as you're going to see here in a few minutes. And he abandoned all this Neoplatonism and all this Manichaeism, and he became just a huge leader in the Catholic Church, the Christian Church. Augustine eventually returned to North Africa, gave up everything but his home, and he converted his home into a monastery. He basically made his home a monastery and turned to preaching, become noted for combating Pelagianism and Manichaeism both, and became eventually the Bishop of Hippo, his own hometown, which is a town in present day in Algeria. While serving as bishop, he wrote several books, but without a doubt, the two that are out there that are still read, and I've read parts of each one of these, not the whole books, but anyway, one of them is called his Confessions. Some people point to this as being the first autobiography, and he just wrote in vivid detail about his life and his life before he became a Christian. And some of it is pretty eye-opening, like, whoa, he did this, he spared no words, and he wasn't proud of it. He was saying, this is what I was before I became a Christian. And then he wrote a book called The City of God, which is still read by an awful lot of church people, particularly in the Catholic Church. The City of God was written at a time when Rome was being, pushed to the limits by the barbarian hordes. And he basically was talking about the suffering of the righteous, the existence of evil, the conflict between free will, divine omniscience, and original sin. He just covered some of the big topics. And it's still one of those books that is very important within the church today, the Catholic Church. 430, Augustine was at his last days. He lived to be a rather older man. The barbarian Vandals had basically spread all over North Africa, and they came to Hippo, and they burned the town. They burned it completely down, except for Augustine's monastery. They had heard of Augustine. They knew who he was, and apparently they had such a respect for him that they actually spared his monastery. And I don't know if it's still standing today or not. I have no idea. But I know that basically it was spared because of the respect they had for him. Even though he was something other than what they were, they felt like, they should honor his being. So this is a painting of Augustine there, contemplating, obviously, Jesus and thinking about some of the important things of his life. So what made Augustine so great? All this is really interesting, but something had to make him great. Well, he is the man that kind of brought it all together. He kind of put an umbrella over all these patristic philosophies and ideas that have been floating around out there for a long time. He is so important to Christian thought that he is actually accepted not just by the Catholic Church, but by the Protestant Church. Martin Luther and John Calvin actually pointed towards Augustine as being instrumental in their thought processes, as bringing about the Protestant Reformation. So Augustine is a giant, folks. I mean, you could argue with him. He had a lot of things that probably I would not agree with, but at the same time, he really had an unbelievable impact upon the growth of Christianity. For instance, and Pastor Dwayne and I have talked about this, he's the guy that brought the concept of original sin out into the open. Now, this, to me, that's so elementary. You know, I grew up hearing about original sin. I thought everybody knew about original sin. But apparently, for the first 200 or 300 years of the history of the early church, it was kind of not really talked about that much. It was implied, obviously, and obviously in the Bible, the apostles talked about it. But it kind of got somewhere along the line, apparently it got kind of pushed back into the background because he's the one that brought the concept of original sin to fruition. And he says, man would not have fallen into sin if Satan had not sown, and this was his words, the root of evil into them, which affected their intelligence and will. Augustine further taught Adam's sin was inherited by all human beings, which made him amongst the first theologians to teach this concept of original sin. It just hadn't really been, he's the one that put it into such simple language. People said, oh, that makes sense. Yeah. Sometimes, we get lost in the weeds and, we can't see the forest for the trees. We've all heard this the same. Another one of his concepts that he really was instrumental in and really had a very big impact in the Protestant churches was the concept of free will. Augustine also taught that God created humans as rational beings possessing free will, which was not intended to exist in an environment of sin. He said, we wouldn't have had free will had we not fallen. Makes sense to me. We would not have had this free will. We would have not been in need of free will had we not encompassed sin into our life. And he said, the only way that you could be free again would be to basically accept God's grace. I mean, this sounds again just like something I heard my whole life in Sunday school. This was kind of the whole concept of, and I don't know that I would put it together in those words, but it's again one of those concepts that Augustine brought to the forefront. The concept of grace. Augustine believed that only when man understands salvation from sin can only be brought about by God's grace. Can we, in Augustine's words, do as you, God, command, and command me to do what you will. Again, the whole concept of grace kind of comes together under Augustine's teaching. He believed grace could not be achieved by man's will, his works, which is defiled by sin, but must be accepted as God's gift in return for our belief in his son, Jesus. I can see where the Protestants would have accepted much of this philosophy that he brought out there. And again, I never realized that Augustine had such a profound effect upon the Protestant religions, particularly Martin Luther and John Calvin, but he did. And then he also brought about the whole concept of predestination. Now, I know there's a big argument going on within many of the Protestant churches today about predestination. I know that churches split quite frequently over this concept, but it's been around now for some time. Augustine taught that God ordered all things during creation while preserving human free will. He believed that predestination was based on God's omnipotent knowledge of whether individuals would believe in Jesus Christ and accept God's grace. Now, here's the big question. Biblical scholars are divided over whether Augustine believed that God chooses some people for damnation, but salvation for others. In other words, it's not that God, some people teach it's not that God just knows what's going to happen. He basically preordains what's going to happen. Big difference between the two. And, this is a big question that I know is still challenging many in the church today and many in the Protestant churches. I know, again, from firsthand knowledge that there's a big argument going on within some of the fundamental churches, Bible believing scriptural churches, whether or not predestination is good or bad, whether or not it's actually there or not. And it's a big question. Augustine he figured this out a long time ago, and again, you can definitely see his influence on John Calvin here. John Calvin is often credited as being the guy that came up with the concept of predestination, and he basically had a great influence here upon John Calvin. So I think you can see where Augustine is, why he is considered such a giant in the church. Whether you accept all of his teachings, whether you accept just a few of them, that's personal individual feeling. But the point of it is, historically, he had a great impact upon the Christian religion. That's just all there is to it. So one last thing here before we quit. This is when the veneration of the Virgin Mary really began to take hold. Now, there had always been a veneration of Mary as the mother of God. This is obvious, we all know this. We've read the scriptures and we know what the Bible says about Mary. But it had never come to the point where Mary had become an intercessory figure, where someone that basically was worshiped in that sense. She was considered an important figure as the mother of God. But at what point did her cult, and I say that word, I want to make sure you understand, I'm not saying that in a any kind of denigration at all, because that's what the church calls it, is the Marian cult. They refer to this as, in a very positive aspect. Not like we, when I think of cult, I think of something not too good, okay? That's not how they consider the veneration of Mary. They consider her cult as very important to them. And it was during this 5th century, during this post-Nicene age, that she became seen as a protectress and an intercessory within the church. She began to be part of a larger Catholic theology. The doctrine had begun to develop under Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, when he articulated Roman salvation history as the second Eve. This is what he called her. And this was followed by Irenaeus, who is often called the first theologian of the Virgin Mother. So during this post-Nicene age, we begin to see these developments. The virgin birth was basically, at this point in time, in 325, the Council of Nicaea accepted. They said the concept of her being a virgin, scripturally, that makes sense. They also declared that she was the mother of God. Not everybody believed that. Not everybody thought that she was the mother of God. She may have been the human person that gave birth to Jesus, but they didn't consider her the mother of God. They also begin to teach at the Second Council of Constantinople in 535 that she was a perpetual virgin. Now, this is where you get into the argument about whether Mary and Joseph's children were all theirs, or whether or not they were the children of Joseph that he brought to the marriage. Because remember, Joseph was quite a bit older, and Mary would probably have been 12 to 14. I know that sounds kind of, when we say that today, everybody goes, ooh, but folks, that was the accepted betrothal age in the Jewish community at this period of time. 12 to 14 was when you would be betrothed and when you would become engaged and married. That was it. That was the common thing. And so there began to be this concept of the fact that she was a perpetual virgin during this period of time. And then by 649, it evolved to the point where she had the absence of original sin, where she was not even, she was so venerated that she no longer had original sin in her. I'm sure that this would have come as a surprise to some of the early apostles. They might not have quite understood this, But this is where the church is today. And again, when I say the church, I'm talking about the Big C Catholic Church. The veneration became enormous in the Middle Ages, and they began to build shrines and cathedrals to her. For instance, we all know what this shrine is. Doesn't look like that today because it's being rebuilt, because remember, it caught fire in 2019. But the Catholic Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris is dedicated to the Virgin Mary. That's what it means, if you don't know. So, they begin to build these huge cathedrals dedicated to her veneration. So the Virgin Mary became a really big part of this early Catholic church, particularly in the Middle Ages. So, coming to the end here, what happened? Well, we all know the story, at least a little bit of it. Rome fell in 476, and with it, the Roman Empire in the West, at least, is seen to, disappear. Something had to replace the Roman Empire in the West. That something became the church, and it became the dominant social, cultural, political, economic unit in the Middle Ages. I mean, if you know anything at all about the history of the Middle Ages, it's all about the church up until about 1300 or so. And then you begin to see the rise of nation states. There were occasionally some people like Charlemagne and some of the German figures that challenged them. And then, of course, Henry VIII come along in the 1400s within England. But it wasn't until the 1400s or so that you begin to see a real rise away from the church as a economic and governmental function. I mean, they were it, folks. I mean, the church was everything in the Middle Ages. And when you're talking about the Middle Ages, you're talking about the Roman Catholic Church, because they ruled totally in the western part. The eastern part still maintained the old concepts of the Roman Empire and became known to us as the Byzantine Empire. And it lasted again until clear into basically the early 1400s, as I remember, basically about 1,000 years later. So at this point, this is where I'm going to end. This is the end of ancient history. And since my whole thrust has been to bring the Bible in the context of the political and social and cultural events of ancient history, this is where I'm going to stop. And I'm going to turn this over at this point and let Pastor Dwayne continue his Bible study and get into the Middle Ages. And he's going to talk an awful lot about the Reformation. And we're going to see how the church broke away and came to split between the Protestant and the Catholic churches, and the growth of the Protestant churches in this period of time. And of course, the Catholic Church did not go away by any means at all. It's still extremely strong in the world. And, it's a very important part of our life. So I hope you enjoyed this. Next week, we're going to start here at the township, our study of local history, Ozarks history. And of course, I began that yesterday for you guys that were following me via Zoom on Arrow. And we're going to talk next week in your end of it about the rivers and the streams and the springs of the Ozarks. For you sitting here in front of me, we'll just be talking about the origins of the Ozarks and a little bit about introducing it to you. So I appreciate being with you today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Rachel, thank you for helping with this. I know I kind of messed up over the weekend, so maybe this will make it right.
Fine. Hey, the weekend threw us all off. So thank you so much for being flexible, and I'll get this posted to our YouTube.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Have a great day.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.